We always talk about sacred texts like they're kind of these eternal things, right? Like they exist outside of all the regular messiness of language. But then you start thinking, what happens when you try to actually like bridge that gap?
Yeah.
When you want to translate something as like foundational as the New Testament, which was originally in Greek, into a language that people are actually using day to day. Why would that be so complicated? You'd think it'd be pretty straightforward, but it's actually caused a ton of controversy.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It really makes you think about language and how it's not just some neutral way to move ideas around. It's so connected to power dynamics and culture and even how we understand the world around us, especially when you're dealing with something as like deeply personal as faith.
Exactly. And speaking of deeply personal faith, our amazing listeners sent us this super detailed research paper. It's called An Overview of the New Testament Translations into Vernacular Greek.
That paper. It's a really thorough look at this whole thing.
It is. It's dense. And that's why we're doing this deep dive today.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the most important and, to be honest, kind of surprising bits for you. No one wants to wade through all that academic jargon, right? So we're going to cut through that and get to the heart of it. Like, what were the key moments in history? What were people arguing about? What kind of lasting impact did all of this have on how people actually experience the New Testament in Greek?
Yeah, we're going to be looking at centuries of like serious effort and pushback and even straight up conflict around translating the New Testament into a language that everyday Greeks could understand.
It's wild.
Yeah, and Vasileiadis does such a good job of laying out the whole historical landscape. He looks at what things were like at the beginning, all the big attempts at translation, and all the different factors that shaped these projects. Like, it's fascinating.
Totally. And when we say factors, we mean everything from the specific Greek text they were using as a starting point to how they were translating it. Were they trying to do a word-for-word thing, or were they being a little more loosey-goosey with it? And then there's the style of Greek they used. Like, were they using the more formal katharousa or the more everyday demotic? Plus, we got to think about who these people were, what their religious backgrounds were, and what was motivating them. It's a lot.
It is. So where do we even begin?
Right. Where do we begin?
I think a really important thing to get is that until the end of the Middle Ages, like around 1453, there wasn't a big movement to translate the Bible into the Greek that people were actually speaking. For centuries, the average person could only really encounter the scriptures in church or in monasteries.
It's kind of hard to imagine, right? This super important text, and most people couldn't even read it in their own language unless they were in a very specific religious setting.
Yeah, it's wild. But there's an interesting little detail here. Vasileiadis mentions that way back in the 11th century, some Greek-speaking Jewish communities were already translating parts of the Hebrew scriptures into more everyday Greek. So you can see that people wanted this. They wanted to connect with these texts in a language they could understand.
So the desire was there, even if it wasn't like happening on a large scale within Christianity.
Yeah. Exactly.
So who makes the first real attempt in the printing era to do something about this within Christianity? Who's stepping up?
Well, you got to give it up for Ionikos Kartanos. He published his HBJKA in 1536, and it was the first real Christian effort to get big chunks of both the Old and New Testaments into a Greek that people could understand.
Awesome.
Yeah, Vasileiadis says it wasn't the most elegant translation, and it was part of this bigger collection of religious writings, but it was a huge deal at the time.
It was. So what was the reaction like? I mean, was everyone stoked or?
Not exactly. Kartanos' work got slammed by the big church authorities. They literally burned copies of it, which is intense. But here's the thing. Despite all that, his book was a huge hit. It got printed like 4 times in the same century.
Wow.
Yeah, Vasileiadis points out that this shows there was this huge desire for people to be able to read the Bible on their own. It wasn't just about being able to understand the words. It was about wanting a personal connection with these texts, not just getting them filtered through church services.
Okay, so we're seeing a shift, but it definitely came with risks. So what happens next?
Well, you also have this growing humanist movement going on at the same time, right? Guys like Desiderius Erasmus were all about translating the Bible into languages that people actually spoke. And this idea was really popular with the Greek religious humanist movement too, guys like Adamantios Korais, even though he preferred a slightly more old-school style of Greek. So you've got this push for accessibility butting heads with the traditional church authorities who wanted to keep things the way they were.
Right. It's like old versus new. And of course, language gets caught in the middle of all this. So moving on, the paper talks about some major players and their translation efforts from the 1600s to the 1800s. Who are some of the big names who tried to make the scriptures more accessible?
Well, we got to talk about Maximus Callipolitis. He's a major figure in the 17th century. His 1638 NTMK was the very first complete New Testament in modern Greek. Huge project, and it was sponsored by Patriarch Cyril Lucaris, which is really interesting.
Okay, so he had some serious backing.
Yeah, but Lucaris's involvement was super controversial, and it ended really tragically for him.
Tragically?
Yeah, the translation was actually published after he died, like just a few months after he was executed.
Whoa. Executed. That's next level. What was going on? Like, why was there so much resistance?
Well, the whole point, and this is actually written in the intro to the translation, was to let people read the Bible on their own. They thought that was a good thing.
Sounds reasonable.
Right. But a lot of people in the Orthodox Church saw that as a dangerous idea. They were worried that it would undermine their authority because they were the ones who were supposed to interpret the scriptures. Theologians like Meletios Syrigos were totally against it, and they even put out these official church statements that basically said, no reading the Bible in plain Greek. And it wasn't just about language, it was about control. They wanted to be the only ones who explained what God was saying.
I get it. So making the Bible understandable was seen as a direct challenge to the power structure.
Pretty much, yeah. For a lot of people back then, messing with the Bible was sacrilegious, even if most people couldn't understand the original Greek anymore. And to make things even more complicated, Vasileiadis points out that Maximus was super critical of corruption within the clergy. He actually wrote that ordinary people suffered more from villainous shepherds than they did from the Ottomans, which is a pretty bold statement, so it's not hard to see why people pushed back against him.
Wow. It's like a whole political drama wrapped up in a translation debate.
It really is.
So even though his sponsor was executed and there was all this opposition, what happened to Maximus's translation? Did it just disappear?
Nope, not at all. Even though it was officially condemned, Maximus's New Testament kept going strong. It was revised and reprinted over and over again, and even adopted by the Russian Bible Society. It was even used in some Greek Orthodox churches for readings during services without the original Greek text, though. And get this, Vasileiadis calls it one of the masterpieces of Greek literary language to this day.
That's saying something.
It is. It really shows you how much of an impact it had and how much people needed a translation they could actually read.
So it survived. That's great. Who else kept this work going in the 1700s?
So in the early 1700s, you have Seraphim of Mytilene. He revised Maximus's translation in 1703, and this version is actually the first one that was published without the original Greek text next to it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it was even included in a multi-language New Testament put together by a German theologian named Johann Jakob Reineccius.
Cool. But I'm guessing it wasn't smooth sailing all the way right.
You know it. Even though Seraphim said he was just trying to tweak Maximus's work, according to the Holy Fathers, the ecumenical patriarchate still condemned it. They didn't like the intro, and they ordered all the copies to be burned.
Ouch, right.
Yikes. Yeah. They did eventually lift the ban after they took out the controversial intro, but Seraphim still had a rough time. He had a lot of personal enemies, especially this guy named Alexander Halladios. And sadly, he ended up dying in exile in Siberia after some trumped-up charges in Russia. It just goes to show how dangerous this kind of work could be.
Absolutely. It's kind of amazing how dedicated these guys were, like risking their lives to make the Bible more accessible. Were there any other major attempts during the 1700s?
Yeah, there was this guy, Anastasios Michael from Nausa. He did another revision in 1710, and he even had some powerful supporters. Sophia Louise of Prussia actually funded it, and it was edited by a big-shot Lutheran scholar named August Hermann Frank.
So this wasn't just some underground operation?
Oh no, this was pretty high profile. Michael's goal was to clean up the spelling and replace any foreign words with good Greek ones. But most scholars think that the church probably rejected this version too.
It seems like every attempt to simplify things just made the church push back harder. Did anything change in the 1800s?
Things started to shift a little bit in the 19th century. We see a new player, Andreas Calvos, a really famous Greek poet. He did some translations of the New Testament, but specifically for the British and Foreign Bible Society, and they were intended for the Anglican Church.
So they were for use in a different denomination.
Yeah, his work was even included in a multi-language edition that had his completely new translation in it, so that's something new.
So working with these international Bible societies was becoming more common.
It was, and that was a good thing because it brought in resources and support. But of course, it also made the Orthodox Church even more suspicious. They started accusing people of being influenced by foreigners and trying to convert people. And then there was this guy, Hilarion of Turnovo, who revised Calipolaitis' translation in the 1820s. He actually had support from the patriarchs Cyril VI and Gregory V, which is huge. And his revised version was even used in the new Greek schools they were setting up.
Wow, so they were using it in schools. That sounds like real progress.
It does, but the resistance was still there. People went after Hilarion's translation so hard that it's actually really rare to find copies of it today. And this guy, Matthias, the Metropolitan of Kyzikos, even questioned whether the people translating the Bible into everyday Greek were sinning. He even compared them to Calvinists, which was like the ultimate insult back then.
Wow. So any hint of straying from the official line was seen as a threat.
Definitely. And this brings us to Neophytos Bombas and his 1844 translation.
Okay, tell me about him.
So Vasileiadis calls his work a paraphrase in the vernacular. Basically, he was trying to stick as closely to the original Greek as he could, word for word wherever possible. And get this, he got help from an American missionary named Jonas King.
Oh, boy.
I know, right? That definitely didn't help with the whole foreign influence accusation. But despite all that, his translation became super popular, and it stayed that way for a long time. And eventually the British and Foreign Bible Society published it, which basically made it the unofficial, official Greek translation for a while. It's actually pretty amazing. It was even translated into modern Demotic Greek in the 1990s.
So Vamvas's translation was a real game changer. But getting there was definitely a bumpy ride. Now, as we head into the 20th century, things get even more interesting because the whole language question in Greece becomes a big deal. How did this affect the translation debate?
So, by the late 1890s, Katharouza, which was initially associated with the intellectual elite, became seen as representing national pride and religious purity, especially when compared to the more radical forms of Demotic. So this whole language debate really affected how people reacted to new translations of the Bible. For example, the Anaplasis Association translated the Gospel of Matthew into simple Katharouza, and it was actually approved by both the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Holy Synod of the Church of Greece.
So a more formal version of the vernacular was okay with at least some parts of the church.
Yeah, but it wasn't that simple. Queen Olga did a translation that was meant for personal use within her family, but that one didn't get approved. And it's interesting because Vasileiadis thinks that maybe it wasn't rejected for linguistic reasons. He suggests that it might have been because of political suspicions about the queen's ties to Slavic interests. It shows how much politics and national identity were getting mixed up with religion and language.
So it wasn't just about the words themselves, but who was translating them and what their allegiances were.
Exactly. And this is even more obvious when you look at the big public debate that was going on at the time. This guy, Professor Georgios Stervos, was making these speeches in the Greek parliament, warning everyone that vernacular translations would lead to total chaos, like what happened when the Byzantine Empire collapsed. On the other hand, you had people like Cherisios Papamarkou, who were fighting to have vernacular translations used in schools so that regular people could understand religious teachings better. And in the end, the Holy Synod came down hard against vernacular translations. They issued a formal statement that called it an unforgivable crime and banned it outright.
Wow, they didn't hold back. And then, of course, there were the Gospel riots of 1901.
Yeah, the Evangelica.
Can you tell us a little more about what sparked those riots and what they mean in this whole saga of translation?
Those riots were a direct and violent reaction to two translations. Alexandros Pallas's translation of the Gospels into radical Demotic Greek and Queen Olga's earlier translation. It was like all the tension around language, national identity, and religion just exploded. The use of Demotic was seen as a total betrayal of the Greek language and their identity, both national and religious. It led to huge protests, and people even died.
It's crazy to think that a Bible translation could cause so much violence.
It really is. It shows how powerful language is, especially when it's tied to sacred texts and national pride. And it also shows how much power the church had back then. After the riots, they made the rules about Bible translation even stricter. They added a clause to the Constitution in 1911 that basically said you couldn't translate the Bible without the okay from the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Holy Synod of the Church of Greece. And that rule, with some changes, is still in effect today.
Wow. So even in the 20th century, the church was still holding tight to the reins.
They were. But the paper mentions a bunch of translations that did come out in the 20th and 21st centuries. So how did they get around all these rules?
Yeah. How do they manage that?
Well, there were a couple of things going on. On the one hand, you had these paraphrased New Testaments from groups like Hizoi, which was a big religious movement. They had a translation by Ioannis Kolitsaras. And then there was Hosoter, another big movement, with a translation by Panagiotis Trimpoulos. These translations were pretty popular with Orthodox believers because they were more like interpretations than straight translations. At the same time, you had more literal translations done by scholars influenced by the ecumenical movement and all the advances in New Testament research. A good example is the Four Professors translation.
So there was this movement towards more scholarly and ecumenical translations happening alongside everything else.
Yeah, but even those projects ran into problems. The New Testament translation of the Holy Gospels, which came out in 1985 and was based on a critical text of the New Testament, was initially rejected by the Church. It took another revision in 1989, where they made it more in line with the traditional text used by the Church to finally get approval from some of the Orthodox patriarchates. This whole thing really shows the tension between modern scholarship and the deeply held traditions of the Orthodox Church.
That tension between critical texts and the traditional text is definitely a recurring theme. Why was the choice of base text so important in these debates?
It gets kind of complicated. The Orthodox Church really values what they call the Byzantine form of text, but the idea of a single official ecclesiastical text isn't actually that clear-cut. The patriarchal text from 1904 is considered authoritative, but it's not a super carefully edited version based on all the ancient Byzantine manuscripts we have. And even the official texts used in church services can have variations. So Greek translators are often hesitant to use critical text because they're afraid it will alienate most Orthodox believers who are more familiar with the traditional text. They'd rather use the ecclesiastical text and avoid any unnecessary drama.
It's like they're trying to walk this tightrope between being accurate and making sure people actually accept and use the translation.
Exactly. And this balancing act also applies to the way they translate, Some are super literal, word for word, while others are more loose and paraphrased. And then there's the whole debate about whether to include the original Greek text alongside the translation, which some people see as a way to make sure everything stays orthodox. What's really interesting is that while literal translations done by non-Orthodox people were often condemned, really paraphrased versions by Orthodox groups were often encouraged and spread around.
It really shows that it wasn't just about language, but also about who had the power to control the Bible and interpret it.
Absolutely. Vasileiadis also talks about this thing called Greek diglossia, which is basically this historical split between a super formal language used in official stuff and the everyday spoken language. And the church has always supported the formal tradition, even though the difference between the two has become less important in everyday life. He also points out that almost all Greek Bible translations were done by Orthodox Christians, and this was in a society where being Orthodox was like being Greek.
So it's all very intertwined. But the paper also points out something kind of surprising. Even though Orthodox Christians were so involved in all these translation efforts, the church itself, like the big guys, never really made their own official vernacular translations.
That's one of the big takeaways from the paper. It's kind of ironic. The church was quick to criticize other people's translations, but they didn't prioritize making their own. So it was mostly up to individual scholars and foreign Bible societies, which, as we've seen, often caused a lot of suspicion and accusations of heresy.
So there was this real need for a Bible that people could understand, but the church wasn't really stepping up to fill that need.
That's a great way to put it. And as Vasileiadis says, even today, Greek Orthodox people still often encounter a language that's far distanced from their mother tongue when they're in church or studying the Bible, which can definitely make it harder to really connect with it. He believes that we need a new way of thinking about Bible translation, one that sees it as part of the intellectual struggle for truth, identity, and freedom.
This deep dive into the history of New Testament translation into everyday Greek has been so eye-opening. It's clear that it's not just about linguistics, but about all these complex issues of religious authority, cultural identity, and power struggles. It's amazing to see how people have been fighting for centuries to make the Bible more accessible.
And we hope that this deep dive has given you, our listener, a better understanding of just how much has gone on behind the scenes and how much these translations have shaped the way people understand and practice their faith. What might seem like a simple question of language turns out to be a really fascinating and complicated story.
It really does. It makes you think about how something as fundamental as the Bible can spark so much debate and controversy. What does that say about the nature of faith and authority? And how about other areas of knowledge or belief systems? Are they facing similar tensions between wanting to be more accessible and holding on to tradition? We encourage you to keep digging into this topic, maybe look into some specific translators or historical periods that we talked about. It's a story that's still relevant today.